The housekeeper locked every door before nightfall, exactly as she had done for years. But one secret inside that house refused to stay hidden, and when Inspector Purbright arrived, he realized the truth was far closer and far more dangerous than anyone had dared to admit. It was generally agreed, though never formally declared, that nothing of consequence occurred in Breadon Vale before 11 in the morning. This understanding had persisted for decades, upheld by gardeners, postmen, and even the vicar, who maintained that urgency was a metropolitan habit best avoided. The village preferred its disturbances to arrive in a measured fashion, softened by routine. On that particular Thursday, however, something had happened before breakfast, and worse, it had happened indoors. Mrs. Dalrymple's housekeeper, Miss Edith Wren, had locked the door. She would later insist firmly, repeatedly, and with a restraint bordering on injury, that she always locked the door. It was, in her estimation, the kind of fact that did not invite discussion. "I have never," she said to the first person who asked, "left that door unsecured, not once, not even in the summer months." This was said not defensively, but with the calm authority of someone who had spent 20 years ensuring that nothing ever went amiss under her supervision. The difficulty lay in what followed. At precisely 7:30, Miss Wren had entered the morning room with a tray, tea, toast, and a single boiled egg, and found that Mrs. Dalrymple had not risen. This, in itself, was unusual, though not immediately alarming. The widow was known to indulge in late mornings when the weather discouraged movement. What was alarming, though Miss Wren did not at first permit herself, the word was that the door to the morning room had been locked from the inside. She had knocked. There had been no reply. She had knocked again, somewhat more firmly, and then, after a pause that she would later describe as perfectly reasonable, she had tried the handle. It had not yielded. There followed a sequence of actions which Miss Wren would recount with careful precision, though listeners would later disagree about their order. She placed the tray on the hall table. She called Mrs. Dalrymple's name. She waited. Finally, she fetched the spare key. It was at this point, she maintained, that the situation became irregular. The spare key, kept in a small drawer beneath the staircase, was not in its place. This discovery did not provoke panic. Miss Wren did not panic, but it introduced, for the first time, the possibility that something was not as it should be. She stood, quite still, in the hallway for several seconds, considering. Then, with a decision that she would later defend as entirely appropriate, she went outside and walked the perimeter of the house. The windows of the morning room were closed. The curtains were partially drawn. Nothing appeared disturbed. And yet, there is, in certain circumstances, a kind of silence that does not belong to absence, but to concealment. Miss Wren would not have described it in such terms, but she felt it nonetheless. When she returned to the front door, she did not immediately re-enter. Instead, she stood on the step, looking at the brass handle as though it might offer clarification. It did not. What she did next was, in its way, quite remarkable. She unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and locked it again behind her. Not hurriedly, not fearfully, but with the same deliberate motion she employed every morning. Only then did she go to the telephone. Inspector Purbright received the message at 9:15. He was, at the time, engaged in the quiet dismantling of a particularly stubborn piece of toast, and regarded the interruption with mild displeasure. "Breadon Vale," said the constable on the line. "Mrs. Dalrymple's residence. Housekeeper reports something unusual." Purbright did not immediately respond. Unusual in what respect? There was a pause, during which the constable appeared to consult his notes, though not with complete confidence. "She says the door was locked from the inside, and now it isn't, or possibly it is, but she cannot say how. Also, the lady has not responded." "I see," said Purbright, though he did not, in fact, see. He considered the matter for a moment, then placed the receiver gently back in its cradle. His breakfast remained unfinished, but he did not return to it. Instead, he rose, collected his coat, and made his way out with the unhurried efficiency that had, over the years, become his most distinguishing feature. By the time he arrived, the situation had already acquired a degree of social complexity. Two neighbors stood at the gate, engaged in a conversation that managed to be both discreet and thoroughly speculative. The postman lingered at a distance, his presence justified by the letters in his bag, though he made no immediate effort to deliver them. Miss Wren herself stood just inside the doorway, her posture conveying both control and an expectation of recognition. Inspector Purbright inclined his head slightly as he approached. "Miss Wren, I presume?" "Yes." "Inspector." Her voice was steady, though not unaffected. "I understand there has been some difficulty." She hesitated, not in uncertainty, but in the selection of appropriate phrasing. "The door," she said, "does not correspond with its circumstances." Purbright regarded her for a moment. "That is a careful way of putting it. I prefer accuracy." "Quite so." He stepped inside. The house was orderly, impeccably so. There was no sign of disturbance in the hall, no indication that anything had occurred beyond the usual rhythms of domestic life. "And Mrs. Dalrymple?" "In the morning room. I have not entered." "Because the door was locked." "Yes." "And now?" Miss Wren paused. "It is not locked," she said, "but it was." Purbright allowed this to settle. "And the spare key?" "Not where it should be." "Have you searched elsewhere?" "I have not," she said, with a faint emphasis. "I do not misplace things." "No," said Purbright. "I expect you do not." He moved toward the morning room. The door stood closed, its surface unmarked, its handle unremarkable in every visible respect. For a moment, he did nothing. Then, quite gently, he turned the handle and pushed. The door opened without resistance. The room beyond was filled with the subdued light of early morning. Mrs. Dalrymple sat in her chair by the window, precisely as she might have been expected to sit at any other hour of any other day. Her hands rested in her lap. Her expression was composed. If there was anything amiss, it was not immediately apparent. Purbright remained in the doorway. He did not approach. Behind him, Miss Wren stood perfectly still. "Well," she said, after a moment, "you see." Purbright did not answer at once. Instead, he observed the room, the arrangement of furniture, the position of objects, the quiet order that had not, it seemed, been disturbed. Then, at last, he spoke. "Yes," he said, "I believe I do." But it was not yet clear what, precisely, he believed. Inspector Purbright did not at once cross the threshold. It was not hesitation, precisely, but a preference for allowing a room to declare itself before one imposed upon it. There are interiors, he had often found, that altered their character under direct scrutiny, as though conscious of being observed. It was sometimes useful to delay that moment. Behind him, Miss Wren remained stationed in the hallway, her presence controlled yet insistent, like a thought that refused to be dismissed. "You have not approached her," Purbright said, still looking into the room. "No." "And you have not touched anything?" "I have not," she replied. "It did not seem appropriate." "Quite." He stepped forward then, quietly, his shoes making no sound upon the carpet. The morning room bore the unmistakable stamp of routine. A small table stood beside Mrs. Dalrymple's chair, upon which rested a book closed, though not decisively so, as if interrupted rather than finished. A pair of spectacles lay beside it, folded with care. The curtains admitted a modest light, sufficient for reading but not yet bright enough to suggest the full arrival of day. Nothing had been overturned. Nothing appeared displaced. Purbright moved a little closer. "Mrs. Dalrymple," he said, not loudly. There was no response. He inclined his head slightly, observing her more closely now, not intrusively, but with a professional attentiveness that did not require display. After a moment, he reached out not to touch her, but to adjust the angle at which he regarded her face. Then he withdrew his hand. "I see," he said again, though differently this time. Miss Wren did not ask what he saw. Instead, she said, "You will require the doctor." Yes, said Purbright. That would be advisable. She nodded once, as if confirming something already decided, and turned to go. I shall telephone at once. If you would. She left him there, alone in the room, and closed the door behind her, not fully, but enough to establish a boundary. Purbright remained where he was. He did not examine the body further. Instead, he allowed his attention to move outward, taking in the quieter details, the placement of the chair in relation to the window, the angle of the rug, the faint impression in the cushion opposite, as though someone might once have sat there but had not done so recently. He noted the absence of the breakfast tray. He noted, too, the stillness. There is a difference, he reflected, between a room that is empty and one that has been left. This room had not been left. It had been concluded. By the time the doctor arrived, the house had acquired an additional layer of observation. The neighbors had not come closer, but their presence had settled into something more permanent, their conversation now conducted in lower tones, with occasional glances toward the front door. The postman had departed, though not without having first delivered the letters, an act performed with unusual care, as if the envelopes themselves might be implicated. Dr. Halcombe entered without ceremony, his manner brisk but not unkind. "Where is she?" he asked. Purbright indicated the morning room. "In here." The doctor passed him without comment and went directly to the chair. Miss Wren stood just outside the doorway now, her hands lightly clasped, her expression composed but attentive. There followed a short interval during which the doctor conducted his examination efficiently, without unnecessary movement, and with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being the final interpreter of such matters. At length, he straightened. "Well," he said, not unkindly, "there is nothing to be done." Miss Wren inclined her head slightly. "I understand." Dr. Halcombe glanced toward Purbright. "Peaceful," he said. "No sign of distress. I should say she passed some hours ago, during the night, most likely. Before Miss Wren's discovery, considerably before." Purbright nodded. "And no indication of irregularity?" The doctor hesitated, not because he doubted his answer, but because he understood the nature of the question. "Not of a medical kind," he said. Purbright accepted this. "Thank you." Dr. Halcombe gathered his things. "I shall make the necessary arrangements," he added, then paused. "Though I expect you will wish to make your own inquiries." "I expect I shall." The doctor gave a small, knowing nod and departed, leaving the three of them in a silence that was no longer uncertain, but defined. It was Miss Wren who spoke first. "Then it was natural," she said. Purbright did not immediately respond. "Natural," he repeated, as if considering the word itself rather than its meaning. "She was not unwell," Miss Wren continued, "but she was not young." "No," said Purbright, "she was not." There was a pause. "And yet," he said, "we have the matter of the door." Miss Wren's hands tightened, though only slightly. "Yes." "You are certain it was locked?" "I am certain." "And when you returned with the key?" "It was missing." "And when you tried the door again?" "It remained locked." "But when I arrived?" "It was not." Purbright regarded her. "You see the difficulty." "I see that something does not align," she said, with a faint edge. "But I do not see how that alters what I know." "What you know," Purbright said gently, "is precisely what we must examine." Miss Wren drew a quiet breath. "I do not make mistakes, Inspector." "No?" he said. "I do not suppose you do." He turned back into the room, his gaze settling once more on the small table beside the chair. "The tray," he said. "I had not yet brought it in," Miss Wren replied. "I set it down in the hall when I found the door locked." "And it remains there?" "Yes." Purbright considered this. "Then nothing has been moved," he said. "Nothing disturbed." "Nothing," she confirmed. "And yet," he said, almost to himself, "something has been altered." He stepped back into the hallway, his attention shifting now from the room to the house itself, the arrangement of doors, the position of the staircase, the quiet order that Miss Wren had maintained with such care. "Miss Wren," he said, after a moment. "Who else has access to this house?" "No one," she said at once. "No one at all?" "There is the gardener," she allowed, "but he does not enter." And Mrs. Dalrymple received very few visitors. "No family?" "A niece," Miss Wren said, "but she is not expected." "Not expected," Purbright repeated. He glanced toward the front door, beyond which the village waited in polite suspension. "Even so," he said, "it seems we have been visited." Miss Wren did not reply. But for the first time since his arrival, her composure shifted, not visibly, not in any way that might be remarked upon by those at the gate, but in the smallest adjustment of stillness, as though something within her had begun, however reluctantly, to reconsider its certainty. Purbright did not immediately pursue the question of visitors. Instead, he turned his attention to the rest of the house, proceeding not with urgency, but with a quiet deliberation that suggested he was less interested in discovering something new than in confirming what ought already to be understood. "The drawing-room," he said, as though the thought had only just occurred to him. "May we?" Miss Wren inclined her head. "Of course." She led the way, though not with the air of someone guiding an inquiry. Rather, she moved, as she might have done on any other morning, her familiarity with the house expressed not in display, but in an absence of hesitation. The drawing-room lay at the front of the house, its windows overlooking the lane. It was a room arranged for reception, though not frequently used. The furniture retained a certain formality, as if awaiting occasions that had grown increasingly rare. Miss Wren opened the door and stood aside. "There is nothing here," she said. Purbright entered without comment. At first glance, her assessment appeared correct. The room was orderly, composed, and entirely undisturbed. Chairs were positioned with careful symmetry. A writing desk stood near the window, its surface clear, save for a blotter and a neatly aligned pen. The fireplace bore no recent trace of use. And yet, Purbright did not accept the room at first glance. He moved slowly, his attention shifting from one detail to another, not in search of disruption, but of intention. "Mrs. Dalrymple used this room often?" he asked. "Less so in recent years," Miss Wren replied. "She preferred the morning room. It was warmer." "And visitors?" "They were received here." "When there were visitors?" "Yes." Purbright paused near the window. From this vantage, the gate was visible, as were the two neighbors who had not yet relinquished their positions. Their conversation had subsided into something quieter now, punctuated by the occasional glance toward the house. "One might expect," he said, almost conversationally, "that a visitor would be noticed." "In Bredon Vale, yes," Miss Wren said. "It is not a place for unnoticed arrivals." "Quite." He turned back into the room. "And yet, we have the suggestion of one." Miss Wren did not reply. Purbright approached the writing desk. The blotter was unmarked. The pen, when he lifted it, bore no sign of recent use. He replaced it precisely as he had found it. Mrs. Dalrymple corresponded regularly. She maintained a certain amount of correspondence, Miss Wren said, though not extensively. "Letters received this morning?" "They were delivered," she said. "I have not yet sorted them." Purbright nodded. "Then we shall leave them for the moment." He moved toward the fireplace, his gaze resting briefly on the mantelpiece. A small clock stood there, its hands indicating a time that had passed unnoticed, 20 minutes to 8. "Is this clock accurate?" he asked. Miss Wren glanced at it. "It is wound regularly," she said. "I cannot say whether it is precise." "Nor can I," Purbright said mildly. "But it is often useful to know what a clock believes." He let the remark settle without explanation. The room, for all its composure, offered no immediate contradiction to Miss Wren's account. There was no sign of intrusion, no displaced object, no indication that anyone had entered uninvited. And yet, Purbright remained unconvinced. "There is a quality," he said, after a moment, "to rooms that have been recently occupied, A certain disturbance of air, perhaps. Or a shift in arrangement so slight as to escape notice. Miss Wren regarded him with a faint tightening of expression. "You believe someone has been here." "I believe," he said, "that something has occurred which requires explanation." "That is not the same thing." "No," he agreed, "but it is related." He crossed to a small side table near the far wall. Upon it rested a silver tray, empty, polished, and positioned with exact care. Purbright looked at it for a moment. "Is this in regular use?" he asked. Miss Wren followed his gaze. "No," she said. "It is kept for occasions." "Special occasions?" "Yes." "And none have occurred recently?" "No." Purbright inclined his head. "And yet it is here. It is always here." "Always?" She hesitated, though only briefly. "It is usually kept in the cabinet," she said, "but I took it out yesterday." "For a particular reason?" I wished to polish it." Purbright considered this. "A task undertaken without occasion." "I prefer not to wait for occasions," Miss Wren said. "They are not always reliable." "No," he said, "they are not." He turned away from the table. The room, for all its quiet order, had begun to suggest something less stable, not through any visible disruption, but through the accumulation of small decisions that did not entirely align. "Miss Wren," he said, "when did you last enter this room?" "Yesterday afternoon." "And it was as it is now?" "Yes." "No difference at all?" "None that I observed." Purbright nodded. "And Mrs. Dalrymple? She did not come in here yesterday." "You are certain?" "I am." He did not challenge her. Instead, he moved toward the door and paused, his hand resting lightly on the frame. "Then we have a room," he said, prepared for a purpose that did not occur. Miss Wren's expression did not change. "I do not see how that concerns the matter of the door." "Nor do I," Purbright said. "Not yet." He stepped into the hallway, leaving the drawing room behind him in its composed stillness. But as he did so, he glanced once more over his shoulder, not at the furniture, nor at the arrangement of objects, but at the space itself, as though considering the possibility that its most significant feature was not what it contained, but what it did not. And in that absence, something, however faint, had begun to take shape. Purbright did not return at once to the question of the door. Instead, he allowed the house to continue speaking in its quieter language, the one composed not of incidents, but of habits. It was a language that required patience and a certain willingness to notice what had never intended to be noticed. "Your mornings," he said, as they moved slowly back toward the hall, "are consistent, I imagine." Miss Wren received this without surprise. "They are," she said. "Consistency is preferable. You rise at the same hour." "Yes." "Prepare breakfast in the same manner." "Yes." "And carry it to Mrs. Dalrymple at the same time each day." "At 7:30. Purbright nodded. "And before that?" "I attend to the kitchen, the fire, the milk." "In that order?" "In that order." He paused. "And the front door?" Miss Wren's expression did not alter, but her reply came with a slight precision. "I unlock it at 6. "And lock it again?" "At night." "Not during the morning?" "No." Purbright considered this. "So, between 6 and 7:30, the door remains unlocked." "Yes." "For the sake of deliveries, perhaps?" "For the sake of routine," she said. "Of course." He moved toward the small table in the hall where the breakfast tray still rested, undisturbed since its placement earlier that morning. The tea had cooled, the toast had lost whatever warmth it had possessed. The egg, untouched, retained its quiet completeness. "You placed this here when you found the door locked," he said. "Yes." "And did not return to it?" "No." "Because of the key?" "Yes." Purbright looked at the tray for a moment longer, then shifted his attention to the staircase. "And the drawer beneath the stairs," he said. "You went there immediately." "I did." and found the spare key missing. Yes. You did not search further. No. Why not? Miss Wren regarded him steadily. Because it is not moved, she said. It is kept in that drawer. Always? Always. Purbright inclined his head slightly. You place a great deal of trust in constancy. I place trust in what I maintain, she said. Quite. He turned from the tray and began to move, not toward any particular destination, but through the space itself, as though tracing the path of the morning in reverse. You rose at your usual time, he said. Unlocked the door at 6, attended to your duties, prepared the tray, and at 7:30 you came here. Yes. And found the door to the morning room locked. Yes. You knocked. I did. No reply. No. You fetched the key. It was not there. You went outside. I did. And when you returned, the door remained locked. Purbright stopped. And yet, he said, when I arrived, it was not. Miss Wren did not answer. He resumed walking, his gaze now shifting to smaller things, the alignment of a chair, the position of a rug, the faint impression of use that marked certain objects and not others. There is a discipline, he said, almost to himself, to a house such as this, a pattern of movement that leaves very little to chance. Miss Wren allowed herself a faint inclination of the head. That is the intention. And within such a pattern, he continued, any deviation becomes noticeable. Yes. Even if it is slight. Yes. He paused near the foot of the stairs. Have you noticed anything else this morning? Miss Wren considered. No, she said. Nothing beyond what I have already described. No small irregularity? No object misplaced? No task interrupted? No. Purbright studied her for a moment. You are quite certain. I am. He did not press the point. Instead, he moved toward a narrow table along the wall, upon which stood a small arrangement of items, letters, neatly stacked, and a pair of gloves placed with care. These were delivered this morning, he said. Yes. You have not sorted them? No, because of the interruption. Yes. Purbright reached out and adjusted the top envelope, not to examine it, but to observe its position relative to the others. They are unopened. Yes. And you would ordinarily attend to them after breakfast. Yes. He nodded. And yet they remain. Yes. He turned back toward her. It is a curious thing, he said, how interruption reveals habit. One sees, in what has not been done, the shape of what is usually done. Miss Wren did not respond. Her stillness had altered, though only slightly. It was no longer the stillness of certainty, but of attention. Purbright moved again, this time toward the door that led to the rear of the house. And the gardener? He said. What time does he arrive? 8, she said. Sometimes a little before. Has he been here today? He has not yet come to the house, but he may be in the grounds. He may. Purbright opened the door a fraction, allowing a brief glance at the garden beyond. Nothing moved. He would not enter without cause, Miss Wren added. No, Purbright said. I do not suppose he would. He closed the door again. And Mrs. Dalrymple? He said, turning back. She was in the habit of locking her door? Miss Wren hesitated. Occasionally, she said, when she wished not to be disturbed. But not every night. No. And not, I think, on this one. Miss Wren's gaze sharpened, though she did not speak. You are certain of that? Purbright asked. She did not mention it, she said, and she would have done, because it would alter your routine. Yes. Purbright considered this. So the door was locked, he said, but not by intention. Miss Wren did not answer. The house, in its quiet order, seemed to hold the question without resolving it. Purbright allowed the silence to settle, not as a pause, but as a continuation, another part of the pattern he was attempting to understand. At length, he said, it is often the smallest habits that prove the most reliable. Miss Wren's expression remained composed, but her voice, when she spoke, carried a faint note of resistance. "My habits are reliable." "I do not doubt it," Purbright said gently. "Which is why it is so interesting when they are not followed." He turned away then, his attention returning once more to the house, not as a collection of rooms, but as a sequence of actions, each one dependent upon the last. And somewhere within that sequence, something had been altered, not dramatically, not visibly, but just enough to disturb the quiet certainty upon which everything else depended. It was not yet clear where that alteration lay, but it had left its mark, however slight, in the pattern of the morning. And patterns, once disturbed, had a way of revealing more than they concealed. The garden, when Purbright stepped into it, presented no immediate assistance. It lay in that early stage of the day when effort had not yet imposed itself upon appearance. The borders were neat, though not newly tended. The paths bore the faint suggestion of use without declaring it, and the air retained the cool stillness of a morning that had not yet committed to warmth. If anything had occurred here, it had done so without disturbing the general agreement that nothing should appear out of place. Purbright closed the door behind him with care and paused, not to survey the whole, but to let his attention settle upon smaller particulars, the edges of the path, the condition of the soil, the alignment of tools near the shed. There is a tendency, he reflected, to look for what is conspicuous, when it is often the inconspicuous that has been most carefully arranged. "You are early today, sir." The voice came from his left, accompanied by the soft scrape of metal against earth. Purbright turned. The gardener, a man of indeterminate age whose expression suggested a long acquaintance with both patience and mild disappointment, straightened slowly from his work. He held a small trowel in one hand, though he did not appear to have been using it with urgency. "Am I?" Purbright said. "A little," the gardener replied. "I'm not usually expected to speak to anyone before 8:30. "Then I shall endeavour not to make a habit of it." The gardener gave a brief nod, as though accepting this as a reasonable compromise. "You've come about the house," he said. "I have." The gardener glanced toward it, not with curiosity, but with a kind of measured acknowledgement. "Miss Wren mentioned something was amiss." "She did." Purbright took a few steps along the path, not approaching the man directly, but positioning himself in such a way that the conversation might proceed without the necessity of formality. "You arrived at your usual time?" "I did. 8:00, just before." "And you came through the gate?" "Yes." "Was it open?" "It generally is." "Today?" The gardener considered. "I believe so," he said. "I don't recall opening it." Purbright nodded. "And the front door?" "I didn't go to it." "You remained in the garden?" "Yes." "From your arrival until now?" "Yes." Purbright allowed a moment to pass. "And during that time, did you observe anyone approaching or leaving the house?" The gardener's expression shifted slightly, not in uncertainty, but in the effort of recollection. "No," he said at last. "No one at all." "No." Purbright regarded him. "You are certain?" "I'm as certain as I can be," the gardener replied. "But I wasn't watching the house." "What were you watching?" "The beds," he said simply. "They require attention." "Of course." Purbright moved a little closer now, though still without any suggestion of pressure. "And yet," he said, "one might expect that a visitor would attract notice." "In the village? Yes," the gardener said. "But from here," he gestured vaguely, toward the far side of the garden, "there are places you don't see the gate." "Even so." "Even so," the gardener agreed, though without conviction. Purbright considered this. "You have been here long," he said. "Some years." "You are familiar with the house?" "I am." "And with its habits?" The gardener gave a small, non-committal movement of the head. "As much as one notices such things. Then you will know whether anything has altered." The gardener looked at him more directly now. "I wouldn't say that," he said. "Things alter without announcing it." "Do they?" "They do." Purbright let this stand. "And this morning," he said, "did anything strike you as altered?" The gardener hesitated. It was not the hesitation of someone withholding information, but of someone attempting to give shape to an impression that resisted it. "There was a light," he said at last. "A light?" In the morning room, Purbright's attention sharpened, though his expression did not. "At what time?" "When I arrived. And this is unusual." The gardener considered. "Not entirely," he said, "but not usual either." "In what way?" "She sometimes leaves the lamp on," he said, "but not always." "And today?" "It was on." Purbright nodded slowly. "And the curtains?" "Partly drawn." "As they are now?" "Yes." Purbright turned slightly, his gaze moving toward the window in question, though from this angle it revealed little. "And you saw no movement?" "No." "No one entering or leaving?" "No." He paused. "And you heard nothing?" The gardener gave a faint, almost apologetic shrug. "I'm not a man who listens for houses," he said. "No," Purbright said. "I do not suppose you are." There was a brief silence, during which the gardener resumed, in a limited fashion, the motion of his work, not with any urgency, but as though to occupy his hands. Purbright watched him for a moment. "And yesterday," he said, "did you notice anything out of the ordinary?" The gardener did not immediately reply. "Yesterday," he repeated, as if testing the word. "Yes." He straightened again, resting the trowel lightly against his palm. "There was someone," he said. Purbright did not move. "Someone at the house?" "Yes." "At what time?" "Late afternoon," the gardener said, "just before I left." "And you saw this person?" "I saw someone at the door." "Who was it?" The gardener's expression settled into something that was not quite uncertainty, but not quite recognition either. "I couldn't say." "You could not see clearly?" "No." "But you saw enough to know it was someone?" "Yes." "A visitor?" "It seemed so." Purbright considered this. "And Miss Wren?" "She was in the house." "She admitted them." "I suppose she must have." "Did you see them leave?" The gardener hesitated again. "I don't recall," he said. "You do not recall?" "No." Purbright allowed the silence to extend, not as a pressure, but as an invitation. "And yet you remember that they were there?" "Yes." "But not how long they remained?" "No." "Nor when they departed?" "No." Purbright inclined his head slightly. "It is a curious memory," he said. The gardener gave a faint, almost rueful expression. "I don't make a point of remembering visitors," he said. "It's not my concern." "No," Purbright said. "But it has become so." The gardener accepted this without argument. "Was there anything distinctive about this person?" Purbright asked. "A figure, perhaps. A manner." The gardener shook his head. "Nothing I could describe." "Male or female?" "I couldn't say." "Height?" "No." "Clothing?" "No." Purbright regarded him for a moment longer. "You have given me," he said, "a presence without a person." "That's as much as I have," the gardener replied. "Indeed." Purbright turned away slightly, his attention returning to the garden, not to its arrangement, but to the quiet fact that something had occurred within it that had left so little trace. A visitor had come, a door had been locked, a key had been moved, and yet the only account of any of it rested upon a memory that declined to be of use. He looked once more toward the house, its windows composed, its surfaces undisturbed. Then he said, almost to himself, "It is not what is remembered that troubles me." The gardener did not respond. "What troubles me," Purbright continued, "is what is not." Purbright did not immediately return to the gardener's account. Instead, he allowed the absence of clarity to settle, as though it were itself a piece of evidence that required equal consideration. The garden, having offered what it could, resumed its quiet indifference to interpretation. He stepped back toward the house, not hurriedly, but with the measured pace of someone who understood that progress in such matters rarely depended on speed. Inside, Miss Wren was no longer in the hallway. The front door stood slightly ajar, as if the boundary between interior and exterior had been permitted a brief relaxation. Purbright closed it gently behind him. The house, once more enclosed, seemed to recover its composure. He found Miss Wren in the kitchen. She was standing at the table, not seated, her hands resting lightly beside a stack of envelopes that had been arranged with evident care. "I have sorted the Morning Post," she said without preamble. "So I see." Her attention remained fixed on the letters. "There is one," she added, "which arrived yesterday afternoon." Purbright did not immediately approach. "You have not opened it." "It is not addressed to me, nor to Mrs. Dalrymple," he said. "No." He stepped closer. The envelope lay apart from the others, not physically disturbed, but positioned with a subtle distinction that suggested it had been set aside with intention. "It arrived yesterday," he repeated. "Yes." "And was not attended to?" "No." "Why not?" Miss Wren's reply was precise. "It was not urgent." Purbright regarded her. "Urgency," he said, "is often declared by the sender rather than the recipient." "I am aware. And yet you decided otherwise." "I did not decide," she said. "I simply did not act upon it." He looked down at the envelope. The handwriting was neat, though not formal. The name of Mrs. Dalrymple was written with a familiarity that suggested prior correspondence, though not necessarily intimacy. "From the niece," Purbright said. "Yes." "You recognized it." "I did." "And still you did not deliver it." "There was no instruction." Purbright nodded slowly. "And Mrs. Dalrymple herself did not ask for it?" "No, because she did not see it." Miss Wren hesitated. "I did not place it before her," she admitted. "Because it was not urgent." "Yes." Purbright allowed a pause. "And yet it arrived before her death." The words were not emphasized, but they altered the air in the kitchen nevertheless. Miss Wren did not react outwardly, though something in her posture tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes," she said. Purbright extended his hand and lifted the envelope. He did not open it. Instead, he examined it briefly, turning it once between his fingers. "And this was delivered yesterday afternoon," he said. "Yes." "At what time?" "After 3. "And you received it?" "Yes." "And placed it aside?" "Yes." "And then resumed your duties?" "I did." Purbright returned the envelope to the table, not precisely in its original position, but close enough that only Miss Wren would have noticed the difference. "You are very precise," he said. "I am. And yet this letter was set apart." "It was not important," she repeated, "or was not perceived as such." Miss Wren did not reply. Purbright turned slightly, his gaze moving toward the kitchen window, beyond which the garden remained still and indifferent. "The niece," he said, "has not been mentioned before today. She is not present in the village. But she exists." "Yes." "And communicates?" "Occasionally." Purbright nodded. "And did she write often?" "Not frequently." "Then a letter from her might, under other circumstances, be considered noteworthy." Miss Wren's voice remained steady. Mrs. Dalrymple did not expect frequent correspondence, but she would expect acknowledgement. "Yes." "And this one was not acknowledged?" "No." Purbright looked back at the envelope. "And yet it was not hidden," he said, "not misplaced, simply set aside." "Yes." He considered this. "And during the night," he said, "no one entered the kitchen?" "No one." "No visitors?" "No." "No movement in the house that you are aware of?" "No." Purbright's attention remained on the envelope. "There is a quality," he said, "to certain objects that have been present in a room for too long without being acted upon. They begin to suggest delay rather than presence." Miss Wren did not comment. "And this letter," he continued, "suggests delay." "It suggests nothing," she said. "It is a letter." "Yes," he agreed. "And yet it has survived the morning without being integrated into it." He paused. "Which is unusual in a household such as this." "Jer." Miss Wren's gaze lifted slightly. "Nothing in this household is unusual," she said. Purbright met her eyes briefly. "That," he said quietly, is precisely what I am beginning to doubt." A silence followed, not uncomfortable, but dense, with the accumulation of small inconsistencies that had yet to resolve into anything complete. At length, Purbright asked, "Where is the remainder of the post?" "In the hall. I shall see it." He moved away, leaving the kitchen with the same measured calm with which he had entered it. Miss Wren did not follow. In the hallway, the remaining letters were still arranged in their careful stack, each one bearing the quiet neutrality of objects not yet assigned meaning. Purbright looked at them without touching. Then, very gently, he said, "One of these belongs to a moment that has already passed." He did not specify which, but the house, in its silence, seemed aware that something among its carefully maintained routines had begun, however slightly, to drift out of alignment. Purbright left the letters where they were. It was not neglect, but sequence. There were objects that gained clarity only when not immediately handled, and the correspondence of Bread on Veil appeared to fall into that category. He returned instead to the hall, where Miss Wren had resumed her position near the staircase, as though the house itself required her continued supervision. "The silver tray," he said. "It remains where it was placed," she replied. "In the hall?" "Yes." "Unmoved?" "Yes." Purbright stepped toward it. The tray sat on the small table, exactly as it had earlier polished, empty, and placed with an almost ceremonial neatness that suggested intention rather than convenience. He did not touch it at first. Instead, he observed it in relation to its surroundings, the tablecloth beneath it, the alignment of the nearby hat stand, the angle at which morning light entered through the front door. "Miss Wren," he said after a moment, "when you brought the tray out this morning, you placed it here because the door was locked." "Yes." "And you did not carry it into the morning room?" "No." "Because you could not enter." "That is correct. And after discovering the key was missing, you did not consider leaving it elsewhere. This was the nearest surface. Convenient." "Yes." Purbright nodded slightly. "And yet it remained here while you went outside, returned, and then telephoned for assistance." "Yes." "So it has been unattended since 7:30. "Yes." He considered this. "And during that time, no one else has touched it?" "No one." "Not the gardener?" "He does not enter the house." "Not any visitor?" "There were none," she said. Purbright allowed the statement to settle. Then he asked, "When did Mrs. Dalrymple last request something be brought to her in the morning room?" Miss Wren hesitated. "Yesterday," she said. "And you complied?" "Yes." "And on previous days?" "Usually." "Then the tray would normally pass through the hall without stopping?" "Yes." "But today it did not?" "No." Purbright turned his attention to the tray again. It was a simple object, unremarkable in itself, yet its presence in the hall suggested a break in continuity, a small deviation from the expected flow of movement within the house. "Miss Wren," he said, "did you notice anything unusual about it when you first placed it here?" "No." "No sound, no disturbance, no indication that anything else had occurred in the house at that moment?" "No." "And when you left it," he continued, "you locked the front door behind you again?" "Yes." "As you always do?" "Yes." Purbright inclined his head. "Except," he said quietly, "you do not always do so during the morning." Miss Wren looked at him. "I locked it because I went outside," she said. "To look for the key?" "Yes." "And before that?" "It was already locked." Purbright paused. "So there was a moment," he said, "when the house was both locked and unlocked within the same morning." Miss Wren did not respond. He stepped closer to the tray, this time lowering his gaze slightly, as though examining not the object itself, but the absence of anything upon it. "And nothing was delivered to Mrs. Dalrymple this morning," he said. "No." "No tea taken in?" "No." "No breakfast served?" "No." "Because the door was locked?" "Yes." "And when it was opened," he added, "she did not respond?" Miss Wren's expression tightened slightly. She had already not responded. She said carefully. Yes, Purbright agreed. He let a moment pass. Then he asked, Who last used this tray? Miss Wren did not answer immediately. I did, she said at last. Yesterday evening. For what purpose? To carry tea. To Mrs. Dalrymple. Yes. And after that? I cleaned it. And returned it. Yes. To its usual place. In the kitchen. Purbright considered this. And yet, it was brought here this morning. Yes. By you. Yes. And not returned. No. He looked at her. Then it has been displaced twice, he said. Once from kitchen to hall. Once from hall to nowhere. It has not been displaced, she said firmly. It has been set down. Twice, he repeated gently. Miss Wren did not correct him further. Purbright turned slightly, his gaze moving now from the tray to the front door itself. When you locked the door this morning, he said, you were alone. Yes. And no one entered before you returned? No one. Yet the spare key was missing. Yes. And the morning room was locked? Yes. He paused. And Mrs. Dalrymple did not unlock it? No. Nor, I think, he added quietly, did she lock it? Miss Wren's eyes held steady, though something behind them had shifted. Then how? She said. Do you explain it? Purbright did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked once more at the tray, as though it might offer some subtle correction to the sequence they had constructed. At last he said, I do not yet explain it. He stepped back. But I note, he continued, that everything we have observed this morning depends upon a series of actions that no one appears to have fully witnessed. Miss Wren said nothing. Purbright's gaze returned to her. And that, he said mildly, is often where difficulty begins. Miss Wren did not immediately respond to Purbright's final remark. Instead, she adjusted her stance slightly, as though re-establishing the balance between herself and the conclusions that were beginning to gather in the hall. There is nothing irregular in the sequence, she said at last. Purbright inclined his head. I am not yet concerned with irregularity, he replied. Only with continuity. I have described everything as it occurred. Yes, he said. You have described it with care. There was a pause. Outside, a faint sound carried from the gate, voices lowered, then restrained again, as though even curiosity required permission before it could be expressed. Miss Wren's gaze shifted briefly toward the door, then returned to Purbright. People are watching, she said. They are observing, he corrected gently. There is a difference. I do not see that it matters. It often does, he said. He moved a little away from the tray now, allowing the hall itself to reassert its structure between them. Miss Wren, he said, you have been in service here for some time. Yes, and you are accustomed to Mrs. Dalrymple's routines. I am, and to her preferences. Yes, and to her health. A slight hesitation. She was not unwell, Miss Wren said carefully. Not unwell, Purbright repeated, but subject to ordinary limitations of age. Yes, he nodded. And would you say she was a person of fixed habits? Very much so. Predictable. Miss Wren did not answer immediately. She preferred order, she said at last, which often produces predictability, Purbright said. Yes. And yesterday evening, he continued, was no exception. No. She took tea as usual. Yes. And retired at her usual time. Yes. And there was nothing in her manner that suggested alteration of routine. No. Purbright paused. Then this morning, he said, we have a sequence of events that begins normally, continues normally, and then becomes uncertain. Miss Wren's voice tightened slightly. I would not describe it that way. How would you describe it? Unexpected, she said. Unexpected implies deviation, Purbright said, which implies a known pattern from which to deviate. She did not respond. He studied her for a moment, not unkindly. "You are under strain," he said. "I am under responsibility," she corrected. "Of course." A brief silence followed. The house itself seemed to contribute to it, its familiar sounds, settling wood, distant movement outside, the faint presence of life beyond the walls forming a backdrop that made the stillness between them more pronounced. Purbright looked toward the staircase. "And the key," he said. Miss Wren's attention sharpened. "Yes. You are certain it was kept in the drawer beneath the stairs?" "It has always been kept there. And when you checked this morning, it was not?" "No." "And has it been found since?" "No." Purbright nodded slowly. "Then it is absent," he said. "Yes. Not misplaced." "I would not say misplaced." "No," he agreed. "You would not." He turned back toward her. "And yet," he said, "it was present yesterday." "Yes." "And used regularly." "Yes." "By whom?" "By me," she said. "And occasionally by Mrs. Dalrymple." "Occasionally." "Yes." Purbright considered this. "So it was not an object without function?" "No." "Which makes its absence more significant." Miss Wren's expression remained composed, though the composure now carried a slight rigidity. "I have already said I do not know where it is," she said. "I accept that," Purbright replied. He stepped slightly closer again, but not intrusively. "And you did not hear anything during the night?" "No." "No movement in the house?" "No." "No sound of doors?" "No." "And no indication that anyone else was awake?" "No." Purbright nodded once more. "Then we are left," he said, "with a locked door that was not locked by its usual mechanism, a key that is missing without trace, and a house that appears to have followed its own routine without admitting deviation." Miss Wren said nothing. He allowed the words to settle. Then he added, almost gently, "And you, Miss Wren, who has never misplaced anything." Her eyes met his fully now. "I do not make errors," she said again, but this time the certainty carried a faint strain. "No," Purbright said, "you do not." He turned away slightly, as though concluding a line of thought. "But even the most careful routines," he added, "can be interrupted without announcing themselves." Miss Wren's reply came after a brief pause. "If something interrupted this house," she said, "it did not come through me." "I did not suggest it did," Purbright said. But he did not add what he had not yet said aloud, that in houses such as this, interruptions rarely announced themselves at all. They simply arrived, already embedded in the sequence of ordinary things, waiting only to be noticed. Purbright did not respond immediately to Miss Wren's last remark. Instead, he allowed the tension in the hallway to settle into something more stable, as though even uncertainty required a moment to find its place within the house. "You have been very precise," he said at last. "I have been truthful," she replied. "I do not doubt that," he said mildly. "Precision and truth are not always the same thing, but they are often companions." Miss Wren's expression remained controlled. Purbright turned slightly, looking again toward the morning room door, still closed now, but no longer carrying the same simplicity it had earlier suggested. "When I arrived," he said, "you told me the door was locked from the inside." "Yes." "And that you could not open it." "Yes." "You attempted with the spare key." "Yes." "And it was missing." "Yes." He paused. "And yet," he continued, "when I turned the handle, it opened without resistance." Miss Wren did not answer. Purbright watched her for a moment. "That is the point at which certainty becomes less comfortable," he said gently. "When an action produces a result that contradicts the expected mechanism." "I did not imagine it," she said quietly. "No," he agreed, "I do not think you did." He moved a step closer to the morning room door again, not touching it, but observing it as though it might reveal something by proximity alone. "A locked door," he said, "implies a decision." "Yes." "A deliberate act." "Yes." And yet we have no clear moment when that decision was made. Miss Wren's gaze sharpened slightly. It was locked, she said again. Yes, Purbright said. But the question is not whether it was locked. The question is how that condition came to be. She did not respond. He continued, softly, now, you assumed, quite reasonably, that the spare key was required to alter the state of the door. I did not assume, she said. That is how it functions. Quite, he said. That is how it is meant to function. A brief silence followed. Purbright turned his attention to the hallway again, as though considering the structure of the house not as rooms, but as a sequence of permissions. Miss Wren, he said, when you first found the door locked, did you test it more than once? Yes. And each time it did not open? Yes. And when you returned from outside? It was the same. And then, when I arrived, it opened, she said, more sharply than before. Yes, he agreed. He let that rest for a moment. Now, he said, let us consider the assumption that has quietly supported all of this. Miss Wren said nothing. You assumed, he continued, that the condition of the door was stable. It was stable. Yes, he said, until it was not. Her eyes remained fixed on him. You are suggesting, she said carefully, that I was mistaken. I am suggesting nothing of the sort, he replied. I am suggesting only that the stability you observed may not have been as continuous as it appeared. That is the same thing, she said. No, Purbright said quietly, it is not. He turned slightly toward the front door again. Let us take a simpler view, he said. Between the moment you first found the door locked and the moment I opened it, something changed. Yes, but we do not know when. No, and we do not know by whom. Miss Wren's voice tightened slightly. There was no one. That is what makes it difficult, he said. A pause followed. Outside, a faint sound of movement passed along the gate again, though no one entered. Purbright did not look toward it this time. Instead, he returned his attention to Miss Wren. You have maintained, he said, that the house followed its routine this morning until the point of interruption. Yes. And that interruption was the locked door. Yes. And the missing key. Yes. He nodded slowly. And yet, he said, there is an alternative interpretation. Miss Wren did not respond. One in which, he continued, the interruption did not occur at the door at all. Her expression shifted slightly, though she did not speak. But earlier, he said. In what way? She asked at last. Purbright regarded her calmly. In the sequence of assumptions that led to the door being found in that state, he said. She frowned faintly. I do not understand. I think you do, he said gently. He paused. You assumed Mrs. Dalrymple did not unlock the door. Yes. You assumed the key was in its place yesterday evening. Yes. You assumed no one entered during the night. Yes. And you assumed, he added, that the morning proceeded as it always does. Yes, she said, more firmly. Purbright nodded once. And if even one of those assumptions is incorrect, he said, then the conclusion changes entirely. Miss Wren held his gaze. What conclusion? She asked. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked past her toward the closed morning room door again, and when he finally spoke, it was with a quiet restraint that matched the house itself. That what appears to be a disruption, he said, may in fact be the continuation of something we have not yet properly identified. Miss Wren did not reply at once. When she did, it was with a controlled stillness that suggested she was choosing not only her words, but the order in which they should be allowed to exist. You are suggesting, she said carefully, that I have misread my own house. I am suggesting, Purbright replied, that we are all prone to arranging events into patterns that feel consistent, even when one element does not belong. That is not an answer. It is an observation, he said mildly. Answers come later. A silence followed, longer than those that had preceded it, as though the house itself had begun to recognize the strain placed upon its established order. Purbright stepped away from the morning room door and returned to the hall table where the silver tray still rested. He did not touch it, but his attention settled upon it again with renewed focus. "Let us consider arrangement," he said. Miss Wren's gaze followed him, though she remained where she was. "Arrangement," he repeated, in the simplest sense. Objects placed where they are expected to be. Actions performed in sequence. Doors locked, keys stored, rooms entered at predictable times. "Yes," she said. "And within that arrangement," he continued, "you have operated for some years without significant deviation." "I have done my duties," she said. "Precisely." He turned slightly toward her. "And because of that continuity, you are able to notice when something does not fit." "Yes, but," he added, "you are also able to assume that what does not fit is an exception rather than a correction." Miss Wren frowned faintly. "I do not assume," she said. Purbright inclined his head. "Then let us say you concluded." Her expression tightened, but she did not object. He continued, "You concluded that the door was locked by someone other than yourself, because you could not account for the mechanism by which it became so." "Yes." "And you concluded that the key was removed, because it was not present where it should have been." "Yes." "And you concluded that no one entered the house, because you did not observe anyone doing so." "Yes." He paused. "All reasonable conclusions," he said. "Then what is your objection?" she asked. "I have none," he replied. This surprised her, though she did not show it overtly. Purbright moved a little further down the hall, as if allowing distance to clarify thought. "My concern," he said, "is not with your conclusions. It is with the arrangement in which they sit. I do not understand the distinction." "I think you do," he said gently. He gestured slightly toward the house around them. "You have arranged your interpretation of this morning so that each event supports the next. The locked door supports the missing key. The missing key supports the absence of entry. The absence of entry supports the conclusion that nothing external interfered." Miss Wren's eyes narrowed slightly. "That is not arrangement," she said. "That is sequence." "Indeed," Purbright said. "And sequence can be persuasive." He paused. "But it is not always complete." A faint sound came from somewhere deeper in the house, a settling pipe, or perhaps the shift of wood responding to temperature, but neither of them reacted. Purbright continued. "What happens," he said, "when we remove a single assumption from that sequence?" Miss Wren remained still. "Which assumption?" she asked. He regarded her. "The assumption," he said, "that the door's condition depended solely upon visible human action." "I did not assume that," she said. "No," he agreed. "You accepted it." She did not respond. Purbright nodded slightly, as though acknowledging something unspoken. "Let us instead consider the possibility that the arrangement of the house itself permitted the change." "That is not possible," she said immediately. "Because it has not occurred before?" "Because it does not occur." A faint trace of something like weariness entered Purbright's expression, though his tone remained even. "Miss Wren," he said, "most things that do not occur are simply things that have not yet been observed under the right conditions." She looked at him more directly now. "What conditions?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned back toward the morning room door. "The conditions," he said at last, "of attention." A pause followed. Miss Wren's voice, when it came, was quieter. "I attended." "Yes," he said. "You attended to what you believed was relevant." She did not reply. Purbright stepped once more toward the hall table, his gaze briefly returning to the silver tray. "And Mrs. Dalrymple," he said, "is no longer able to confirm any of this." The words were gentle, but final in their implication. Miss Wren's composure held, though only just. "No," she said. And the letter, he added, which arrived yesterday, remains unopened. Yes. And the key remains missing. Yes. He nodded. So we have, he said, a sequence of well-observed events, each dependent upon an assumption that cannot be independently verified. Miss Wren's hands tightened slightly at her sides. Then what do you propose? She asked. Purbright looked at her for a long moment. I propose, he said quietly, that we stop arranging the truth in the order that is most comfortable. A silence followed. This time, it was not the house that held it, but the two of them, and in that silence, something that had until now remained carefully aligned within Miss Wren's understanding of the morning began, ever so slightly, to shift out of place. Miss Wren did not immediately respond to Purbright's final statement. When she did, her voice was quieter than before, as though the house itself required a lower register to remain undisturbed. Then what remains? She asked. If we remove arrangement? Purbright did not answer at once. Instead, he looked once more at the morning room door, then at the hall table, then at the faint pattern of light falling across the polished surface of the silver tray. What remains, he said finally, is what has not been accounted for. Miss Wren frowned slightly. That is not helpful. It is not meant to be, he replied gently. It is simply accurate. A pause followed. Purbright stepped toward the staircase and, for the first time since his arrival, looked upward as though considering not the house as it stood, but the movements that had passed through it unseen. You unlocked the front door at 6, he said. Yes. And left it unlocked until 7:30. Yes. During which time the house was, for a period, accessible without restriction. Yes. And in that period, he continued, we have no confirmed observation of the morning room door. Miss Wren's expression tightened slightly. I did not leave it unattended, she said. No, Purbright agreed. You left it assumed. She did not respond. He returned his attention to her. When you first found it locked, he said, you assumed continuity. Yes. That nothing had intervened between your routine and its disruption. Yes. And when the key was missing, he continued, you assumed removal. Yes. And when no one was seen, he added, you assumed absence. Yes. Purbright nodded slowly. And yet, he said, there is one thing in this house that does not conform to any of those assumptions. Miss Wren's eyes followed his movement as he turned back toward the hall table. The silver tray, he said. Her gaze flickered. It is nothing, she said quickly. It was placed there by me. Yes, Purbright said. And it remained there while the sequence unfolded around it. It is irrelevant. No, he said quietly. It is simply unexamined. He stepped closer to it now, not touching it, but observing it with a different attention than before. When something is placed deliberately, he said, and remains undisturbed through a series of events that otherwise show no external interference, it becomes informative. Miss Wren did not respond. Purbright continued. Tell me, he said, did Mrs. Dalrymple ever use this tray herself? Yes, she said after a moment. Occasionally. And would she have done so this morning had she been able? A slight hesitation. Yes. But she did not. No. And the tray remained here, he said, unused, unnoticed, and unchanged. Yes. He nodded once. Then it has borne witness, he said softly, to a morning that did not pass through it. Miss Wren's voice tightened. That is an interpretation. Yes, Purbright agreed. But it is not the only one. He turned back toward her. There is another possibility, he said. She did not speak. One in which the sequence you have described is accurate, he continued, but incomplete in its beginning. Incomplete? She repeated. Yes. He paused. In which the door was not locked as the result of interruption, he said. but as the continuation of something that had already begun before you reached it. Miss Wren's composure faltered for the first time, not dramatically, but in the smallest withdrawal of certainty. "That makes no sense," she said. "Not yet," he replied. A silence followed. Purbright's gaze remained steady. "Miss Wren," he said, "when did you last see Mrs. Dalrymple alive and fully responsive?" "Yesterday evening," she said immediately. "After tea?" "Yes." "And she was, as she usually was?" "Yes." "Nothing unusual in her manner?" "No." He nodded. "And yet," he said, "you did not enter the morning room again until this morning?" "No." "So between yesterday evening and this morning," he said, "there is a span of time that has not been directly observed?" "Yes." "And within that span," he continued, "something occurred which we are only now attempting to reconstruct from its effects." Miss Wren said nothing. Purbright stepped slightly aside, allowing the full arrangement of hall, door, tray, and staircase to sit between them like a quiet diagram. "And so," he said, "the question is no longer who locked the door." He paused, but what was not locked away with it? For a moment, neither of them moved. The house remained as it had been, orderly, composed, unchanged in appearance, but the logic that had supported its mourning no longer sat in its original alignment. And in that slight dislocation, something long contained within its quiet routine began, at last, to feel exposed to view.